So, Lone Rider here. And it's kind of funny. I was actually reading a interesting article the other day where they were talking about mountain biking in the 1990s and old school mountain biking generally, and basically how things are so much better now and stuff back then sucked. And I guess maybe this is a function of age. If you weren't around back then, you're just kind of looking at it like, oh, it's a bunch of old school crap that is completely useless now. Actually, it's kind of funny. I went to a bike shop a while ago. I don't have the bike anymore, but I got a Surly 1x1, single speed steel frame bike that was equipped with some pretty funky cantilevers. And I remember I went to my friend's bike shop was closed for like a day or two. He was out of town, so I went to another bike shop, which shall remain nameless. I don't want to make anybody look bad on the internet, but it was a bike shop. Let me put it that way. And I went in there. Now the bike had cantilevers, right? So hanging from the seat clamp was a cable guide, cable stop. So I went in there with this Surly single speed mountain bike, and I asked the guy. I was looking for a new seat collar, seat post clamp. I said though the space in the back has to be sufficient to fit the width of the cable hanger when it's tightened down. Otherwise, if that cable hanger either doesn't fit or can't move freely, it's not going to work. So it has to fit in there and it has to not get jammed up. So the person who was helping me, a young kid who looked like he should have still been in school, and by that I mean, like junior high school. He didn't look like he shaved yet. He was helping me out, and he pointed at the brake hanger, and he goes, "What's this thing?" And he sort of flicks it with his finger. Now, that's where your cable runs into your brakes. Okay, if he doesn't know what that is, he probably shouldn't be working at a bike shop. And I was just like, I hang out, and even to this day, sometimes I hang out at my friend's bike shop, and I'm always trying to learn, right? But I remember back when I was younger and I started hanging out there, it was always about learning, right? And even before I knew where his bike shop was, there was another local bike shop. I would hang out there, and after the road racers would come by, and I was mostly into mountain bikes back then, but the road racers would come by after one of their fast long rides, and they'd all be out there cleaning off their bikes, and I'd sit there and just kind of listen to what they were saying, and I was like a teenager, but I wanted to learn, right? And I started hanging out at my friend's bike shop, and I want to learn. It's always, what's this do? What's that do? What's this for? And then to this day, I've never ceased from learning. If you stop learning, there's something wrong with you. By the way, it's human nature to be inquisitive and to wonder and to question. But more to the point, if you're in a particular thing, like most people. Now there might be somebody who gets a job at a bike shop just like they might get a job at like Wendy's or Pathmark, just because it's a job and they really don't have any particular affinity. It's not like they have dreams of a career in fast food or supermarket industries. But nevertheless, generally speaking, when you go into something a little more specialized, like an archery shop, a music shop, a bike shop, it's because you really enjoy bikes, right? Like, you don't really have that many people working at a music shop who hate music. You don't really have that many people at an archery shop who've never shot a bow before. It boggles my mind that you wouldn't have somebody working at a bicycle shop who wasn't enthusiastic about bikes. But the funny part is, right? So he may have been enthusiastic about bikes, but not in general. I pointed out, I said, dude, that's you're all like, what is this thing? I was like, that's the cable hanger for the brakes. Like that, if you only know what one part of the bicycle does, that should be the one you need. And he goes, well, what kind of brakes are these? I never seen brakes like that before. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, he's a young kid, but they still use cantilevers on some bikes. Custom retro builds will have them. Certain cyclocross bikes, and of course, any older bike that comes into the shop to get worked on is going to have them if it's older than, let's say, the mid to early 90s, maybe. So, it amazes. And they, by the way, they kept using them for a while. And even after these linear polar V brakes were introduced, not everybody went to them right away. And a lot of guys like me, I remember I used to get a bike with V brakes and take them off and put candies on it because that's what I was comfortable with. It took me a long time to get comfortable with V brakes. Excuse me. Also, the levers pull a different amount of cable. So if you've got a really nice pair of levers you want to use, those levers are only going to work with one or the other unless you have some kind of an adapter. And those are usually, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I remember the big one was the travel agent. It was this little round pulley thing. But anyway, the point is, cantilevers have been around. They're not really used now all that much on new bikes. But if your bike shop does any kind of repairs, you must have seen them before, right? So this kid apparently had never seen him. I guess, unlike me, who just hangs out at the bike shop, even though he actually works at a bike shop, he's not keeping his eyes open and trying to learn. And I'm always like, I'm always trying to learn. I'm always like, well, what is that? And what is, and it amazes me that somebody who's working at a bike shop and actually getting paid to do the stuff is not that into it. I guess it's, I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing too. Maybe young people his age really do look at this as, well, a bunch of, old-timey shit. Excuse my French. Because that's actually what happened next. I ended up explaining that these are cantilever brakes and it's what everybody used before V brakes. And he kind of looks at me and he goes, what are V brakes? I said, V brakes, linear pole brakes, what everybody used before discs. And he goes, oh, discs, I know discs. And I said, yeah, but what about cantilevers and V brakes? And he says, oh, I don't know about that old-timey stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, old-timey? Now, the bike does have retro brakes on it, if you will, but the bike itself isn't old, right? It's certainly one by one. It's from, what was it from? I don't know, it was early 2000s or something. And this happened some years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, so it wasn't like it was recent. The bike was contemporaneous, in other words, with the time period in which this occurred. It wasn't like it was a 20-year-old bike. Now, did it have older style brakes on it? Yes, but cool thing about building up a single speed from a frame only, or any bike from a frame only, is you can customize. And I just thought it was funny that also somebody would be able to appreciate the modern stuff without comparison to its antecedents. It's kind of like, side pulls are really great. Yeah, but if you know what a spoon brake was, side pulls seem really, really great, right? By comparison. It's kind of like, okay, to appreciate, if you really do think that disc brakes are all that, and that's the only type of brakes anybody should ever have on a bicycle, that's fine. That's your opinion, but it's fine. But then presumably you're touting the benefits of disc brakes. It's not just because they're whatever most people are using nowadays on newer stuff. It should be because there's some kind of actual advantage that you can enunciate. For example, like, well, they stop better when they're wet, in the rain or the mud. Or they're, if your wheel gets knocked out of tube, it'll still spin because there's not a big brake hanging up there by the rim. That sort of thing. Which are two actual advantages of discs. Of course, they're also heavier, they're harder to maintain, they're not really useful for certain applications, like road bikes, for example. And I'm going to be honest, a lot of my mountain bikes, like this yellow bike here, actually do still have these. So I just did think it was funny that this young kid who works at a bike shop, doesn't even know what the derailleur hanger is. I mean, the derailleur hanger. The brake cable hanger for the cantilever brakes, because he doesn't know what cantilevers are. I was like, my God, you work at a bike? And again, I understand he probably has never seen a new bike with cantilevers because they don't use them for new bikes. But working at the bike shop, if he sees a bike come in for a repair that has some kind of older style of brake that he's not familiar with, You think he would have done what I did and everybody else who ever hung out at a bike shop did, and say to the mechanic, hey, what are those? How do they work? Right? I mean, just a thought. But anyway, enough about that. It was funny though, after my friend who runs the local bike shop I normally go to came back, I remember I described this to him and he said, oh yeah, that happens all the time now. The bike shops are hiring people who aren't really, either aren't really mechanically inclined or their heart isn't in it, so they're not going to bother to learn anything beyond what they're being paid to do. But I wanted to talk in particular about this type of thing in general beyond cantilevers. Although cantilevers is a good starting point because, of course, whether you're talking about cantilevers or V-brakes like this bike has, a bike that's older and has rim brakes is usually going to be lighter. Right? Maybe not if they're like Magura hydraulics, but if they're regular brakes, actuated by a cable, regular rim brakes, so like these or like cantilevers, it's going to be lighter, right? It's going to be lighter than disc. And that's kind of like getting back to what I was talking to you about that article where they were talking about, how bikes back in the day were all crap and everything now is wonderful. You had less travel on your bike, right? You were lucky to have a front shock. My first store-bought mountain bike didn't have a front shock. I had the shock put on there after I tweaked the fork, doing something incredibly foolish. Most of them didn't have back shocks. That was still in its infancy. Front shocks were starting to come into their own by the mid to late 90s. And they were really taking off by the late 90s, early 2000s. But rear suspension was still, really didn't start to get worked out till the late 90s, and then there was still a development period after that. So, you had less travel on your bike. You had less shocks. But you know what? Your bike was lighter, right? Maybe you only had a front fork, and the front fork didn't have that much travel. But as a result, your bike is lighter, right? You had a different ride position, right? It was more forward. Usually they had longer stems. I can't do that anymore, so mine's a little higher and the stem's a little shorter. It's slightly more angled, but this is still approximately the type of riding position you would find on a bike from that era, the mid to late 90s, early 2000s. It's just that the stem would usually be a little longer. Now, as you got closer to the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, the stems got shorter and the bars got slightly more upright. You started to see more riser bars, which previously had been reserved for things like downhilling. But the point is that this is the aesthetic of a bike from that time period, generally speaking, except the stems were, like I said, usually a little longer. What is the advantage to this? Well, it's fast. You're stretched out a little more. You are somewhat more upright, so it's not like a road bike. And then the bar ends give you extra hand positions if you're climbing, right? These are stubby ones that I made myself. I just cut them down. But I do like bar ends on flat bars at times. Not all of them have them, but some of them do. So your ride position is more conducive to all-around riding, not just descending over bumpy stuff. So climbing, sprinting, standing on the pedals, etc. It's as suited for going over bumpy stuff as it is for smooth, hard pack or dirt single track or even a dirt road or whatever. The gears. Well, you didn't have as many gears in the back, right? As we like to describe it, back in the day, hair was big and gears were small. And the truth is that there is some truth to that. You might have only had 7 gears in the back if you were lucky, maybe 8, maybe. Usually 7 was the max. But you had 3 gears in front, right? You didn't just have a 1x or a double. You had a triple in the front. And that triple had a granny gear, which allowed you to go up pretty much any damn thing, even if all you had was 7 gears in the back. Secondly, the gears you did have in the back, it was more spaced out, the gearing. So it wasn't as, you only had 7 gears, but it wasn't like taking a 10-speed cassette and throwing, a third of it away. It was like taking that 10-speed cassette and just taking out some of the index points so that it was more of a wider range. Which brings me to the next thing. Some of them had friction shift. If they didn't have friction shift, they could micro adjust for the front gears. Now this bike of course is a single front chainring because that's how I built it up. But originally this was a 3x9, which was the kind of the last vestige of the traditional mountain bike setup, which of course, started as, 3x6 and 3x7 back in the day. My first mountain bike only had 7 gears in the back and 3 in the front. It was a Trek 820, if I remember correctly. But this, when it did have a front shifter, before I customized the front setup, the shifter allowed you to fine tune the front derailleur position so that you never had chain rub, right? So now you have index shifting on both the front and the rear, if you do have, this obviously only has one shifter because it's only got the one derailleur, but if you have let's say a double in the front, and then now you have index shifting on the front and the back, but like what's the point with index shifting on the front? You just lose your ability to adjust it and eliminate chain rub. Especially as you have more gears in the back, your chain angle's going to be greater anyway. So, and then comfort of riding the bike. The bike may be more, I don't know what the word is. It may be more plush with all the travel. But what about when you're riding and you're trying to go like up a hill, or you're trying to, the bike. Back in the day, bikes used to weigh like maybe, 26, 28 pounds, right? Now they weigh like 28 to 30 pounds, and 28 is like the start. What was like the heaviest you used to see back then is now the starting point. And that's for bikes that are much more expensive and come with a lot more crap to take care of, which is the last thing I wanted to touch on. There's so many things I can touch on, but the last thing I wanted to touch on before I get to my main point is that the bikes were easier to maintain. If it was rigid, you didn't even have to worry about shocks. If it did have shocks, half the time they were either an elastomer, meaning rubber bumper, or an oil and spring arrangement. So a lot of times you didn't really have to put air in them or worry about the seals, in the sense of air seals anyway. And of course, if it was rigid, then you just didn't have a shock. And if you did have an air shock, they were usually pretty simple. So, it was just a lot less to maintain on the bikes. Same thing with the brakes, as I mentioned, in comparison to discs. If you've got rim brakes, they're a lot easier to take care of. You can just see the pads real easily, see the wear. Just a lot simpler. And then the last thing, of course, is because everything was simpler with bike, the rider had to do a little more. It's kind of like what I've said about single speeds, where the machine does less, so you have to do more. It's definitely not the most efficient. It's definitely not the most, mechanically advanced. But sometimes it can be the most satisfying. And it is kind of funny. Those of us who either never got rid of our old school bikes, or who remember them fondly and are either rebuilding one or have rebuilt one. This is just one of the older mountain bikes I have lying around. And this wasn't old when I got it. This was actually only about a year or two old when I got it. So I've had this. I'm basically the original owner, except for the person who sold it to me. But one of the things you remember about bikes like this is, yes, you had to do more. It was more work. It was more, more on you than on the bike. But at the same time, it was that much more rewarding, that much more entertaining, that much more mind-blowing when you got to the top of a hill or cleared an obstacle or did whatever. And I was never really hardcore. I did some stupid stuff when I was a teenager, like trying to jump a drainage culvert or ride up the wall of a concrete drainage channel. I do remember trying to ride stuff in the woods where it wasn't a good idea to try and ride it because it was too steep. And actually, one point I remember actually going backwards off the bike when it tipped like this. But hey, when you're 18 or 17 or whatever, you do stupid stuff. Now, here's the funny part. The bike handles it all with no problem. Again, easier to take care of, less to break. Right? And I wish I still had that first mountain bike. But I have plenty of older mountain bikes that I do still ride. And I think it's funny when people talk about bikes like this as if it's, belongs in a museum. And it's like, dude, I was out there, yesterday I did 15 miles on it, or, 20 miles on it, or whatever it is. I remember first time I took this to, Lewis Morris, and I went on some of the gnarlier trails, and, you know, it was fun. It was really, really, really fun. Would it have been also fun if I did it on my dual suspension mountain bike? Probably, but not in the same way, right? In a real sense, when you have an older bike like this, far from sucking and being atrocious and awful, it's almost like a time machine. Nothing is ever going to make, you know, take 20 years off my life and make me as young as I was back in the day. But for a brief moment in time, if I'm riding one of these older bikes and I'm going down a trail, I feel 20 years younger, right? And hell, here, you can't put a price on that. So, you know, yeah, modern mountain bikes are great. You know what? I like them. Don't get me wrong, I like them. But there's just something to be said for the old school, the vintage, and the not so new stuff. And you know, yeah, would I like to have like a $3,000 brand new, you know, 650B blah 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 mountain bike? Probably, but would I ever ride it? Honestly, I don't know, right? It might just sit there in the corner gathering dust while I rode bikes like this or my single speed. And that I think is the biggest endorsement of all of this old school tech. That it's not just, well, you don't have anything better to ride. There's plenty of better stuff I could be riding. I choose to ride this. All right? I choose to ride this. And that should say something. Lone Rider out.